Hey everybody, welcome to a very special bonus episode of Talking to Ton. Michael and I, we were sort of chatting recently over a nice steak dinner about what, if any, movie we would want to cover from this year. If the well ever ran dry, Talking to Ton, if we ever ran
like it
out of.
would.
Yeah, right. If we ever ran out of rocks to turn over and new subjects of discourse, obviously that would never be the case. But what other movie from this year would we want to discuss on the podcast? And we both said at the drop of the hat, no questions asked, Licorice Pizza.
Licorice pizza.
Absolutely. And so we figured, what the heck? We're not going to miss a main feed episode of Talking to Ton, obviously, but we thought, why not do a little something extra for the kids out there, a little stocking stuffer for them, if you will, a little bonus ep discussing another great filmmaker, Paul Thomas Anderson, and his 2021 offering, Licorice Pizza. So, Michael, what do you got?
I'll say this. This is a movie that I was excited about before it came out. I'm a big Paul Thomas Anderson guy, someone I kind of grew into in life. I don't think I really got Paul Thomas Anderson until like 2015 when I went back and started watching his films. But I was excited about this movie. There was a lot of mystery around it. And I was actually in one of the theaters in Los Angeles the first weekend they were showing the trailer on 35 millimeter at two different theaters in Los Angeles. And I think I was at like the second or third screening where it played. And I found it electrifying. Like the trailer to this movie itself, it got me so excited. And the movie didn't disappoint. I've seen it twice. I'm seeing it again for Christmas Day. This will already be out after that happens. But I'm a fan. I think it does a lot of very cool things. I don't think it's his best movie. I don't even think it's in his top 3. But I think it's a great film. And I think especially considering it's carried by 2 first-time actors is incredible. And I still find myself reflecting on that with all of the incredible performances we've had in films this year by some of the most seasoned actors in the game. The fact that 2 newbies carried a PTA film and carried it to a satisfying completion. Just wonderful stuff.
And there's also this lovely sense of kinship or family about the film in a weird way that, like, having watched all of his music videos that he's done with the Haim sisters and knowing his working relationship with Philip Seymour Hoffman, like just seeing this come together in a weird way that just, it feels sort of inauspicious. It feels not necessarily like a home movie because obviously like it's a very accurate period piece. There's obviously a lot of money that went into it, especially for an independent film. But there's still this real sense of charm and life to it. And I think that has a lot to do with the two lead performers. They're both very natural on screen, and they clearly have like a sense of security with the director that I not to be presumptuous, but I imagine because of his working relationship and just interpersonal relationship with both of them, that it was maybe a little bit easier to just like give themselves over to this process and not approach it with the pressure of like, oh, this is my feature debut or whatever. This is a movie that seems almost inauspicious in his filmography. Not that it doesn't fit in there, but he's been on a run of such like towering epics of either like There Will Be Blood, which is one of the best movies of the 21st century, and The Master, which is just so grand and so ambitious in scale, and Phantom Thread, which is my favorite of his, which is much smaller scale but still has like big questions and is a really interesting period approximation, and there's so much that he's doing even when he's working on a smaller scale like this that really elevates the material. And I loved it. I've only seen it the once, but it's like a lot of his movies. I think it's one that kind of works on you a little bit after the fact, and you want to revisit the energy and the vibe.
Yeah, I mean, it does, and this is second a lot of what you just said, but it makes me think of sometimes how you listen to an album And it sounds like the band or the artist were having fun when they made that
Sure.
album. This is a movie that it leaves you feeling like the cast and crew were having fun as they made it. And part of me thinks it's probably because it got made, middle of a pandemic when a lot of these people hadn't been around humans in a while and they got to be together in a community making the film. But that's something that stuck with me. And I think that's why it's a movie that feels like it was fun to make. And it's a fun movie to sit in a theater with and watch with other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's fun to think about afterwards. And I would definitely say, well, we're obviously going to talk a lot about this movie, but if you are in a position where you can see this movie in a theater and you're in between whether you want to wait for streaming or whatever, if you feel safe, if you're able, if it's a possibility, for me, this is a must see in a movie theater if you can.
And I would also, just to tag that right now, I've seen a lot of folks mention this on Twitter and the like, that if you don't necessarily feel safe about going to movies right now, I don't blame you. But this is probably the kind of movie with something like Spider-Man right now making box office records and attracting a lot of movie-going folks. This is probably the kind of movie you will be able to see relatively safely. Hopefully it does well. Hopefully it brings in some box office. But I know there are a lot of movies out there right now who are kind of, I hesitate to even say fighting for second because Spider-Man is taking up so much oxygen. But I do think that a movie like this or Nightmare Alley, you can probably feel relatively safe with a less crowded viewing experience. And I highly recommend seeing this one as well.
Okay, so it's not a super plotty film. We'll do a quick synopsis before we get into it. So, Licorice Pizza is a movie that takes place in 1970, Thomas Anderson's beloved home of the San Fernando Valley. It's a story about a sort of platonic love between two characters, 15-year-old Gary Valentine, who's a young actor, hustler, businessman, regular at the Tail of the Cock restaurant, and Alana, and I think her name is Keen in the movie. Kane, yeah, Alana Kane. And Alana, who is a 25-year-old edgy and angry young woman who works at a photography studio she hates where she's sexually harassed by the boss. These two meet up and, fun ensues. Throughout the film, Gary starts a number of businesses because his child acting career is on its way out and he knows he has to pivot. Alana ends up helping him in those business pursuits, and we see them start a water bed business. We see Gary put together his own pinball club in the San Fernando Valley, and along the way, they run into some incredible characters, many of whom are based on real life people who existed in the Los Angeles of the 70s. And by the end of the film, we see what happens when two people who have been fighting to, I guess, hold on to a bit of youth and a bit of hope, find each other and go running off into the valley together. There's not a lot that I could say to spoil this movie. There's not a ton to say plot-wise, but I'd say it's mostly these two people and a bit of a push and pull, spending an indeterminate amount of time together in the valley. I don't know. I don't know what else to say. I don't know what one could say to really, because it's not really the plot. It's just it's two people hanging out.
Yeah, more or less. It's definitely a very kind of like it's obviously sort of nostalgia fueled, but I hesitated to say that just because I think that means something very different in a lot of like pop culture discourse, whether it's Stranger Things or Ghostbusters or whatever, or even I mentioned Spider-Man earlier. Like I think a lot of movies nowadays get knocked with that notion of like, oh well, it's just a nostalgia trip, and it's but this is this certainly qualifies as such, and it does. If you're a fan of like Richard Linklater, maybe Dazed and Confused. I know Paul Thomas Anderson cited as another film that was an inspiration on this. There is, I mentioned before, it's so much about an energy and about a vibe. I was kind of curious what you would want to talk about during this episode and like what our talking points even would be, like from your perspective as a philosopher. I really personally, as a film fan and enthusiast, I loved seeing, I thought Bradley Cooper plays John Peters in the movie. if you don't know who John Peters is, listening at home, he started off as Barbara Streisand's hairdresser. There's a really good Warren Beatty movie based on him. It's called Shampoo, and his relationship with Barbara Streisand sort of turned into a romantic relationship, and based on his relationship with her, he became something of a power player in Hollywood. He produced a ton of movies up to like there's a really great Kevin Smith story about how when John Peters was producing Superman Lives to be directed by Tim Burton, that he kept pressing Kevin Smith to write a big robotic spider into it, and then Kevin Smith talks about how he went to go see Wild Wild West, another John Peters production.
Oh my God.
And that the giant mechanical spider finally showed up in that one. And it was just this weird like through line of this guy who has a weird fixation on giant mechanical spiders finally got like harangued a filmmaker into putting it into a movie. But there's a lot of stuff like that of I don't Michael, I'm sure you know this, that Paul Thomas Anderson's his dad worked in television. Ernie Anderson, he was a like a late night television host named Goulardi, who did like the sort of regional Elvira or Zachary thing,
Yeah,
where he'd introduce
Cleveland,
horror
right?
movies. And yeah. I think it was Cleveland.
Yeah.
And there are so many scenes in this film that, in addition to some of the things that PTA has talked about drawing from in interviews, there's so much stuff that very clearly feels like it was ripped straight out of his childhood.
Oh, definitely.
Of, you know, growing up in and around this business and having friends and friends of friends that were in the industry and stuff like that. And it's just a really like, it's a weirdly kind of like, not just observational, but almost passive in how it views those things. It sort of devoid of judgment. Like he presents there's been a lot of chatter online about some somewhat controversial scenes in the film, particularly one regarding John Michael Higgins' character, who does a pretty offensive, like faux Japanese dialect when he's talking to his Japanese wives. And when asked about that, Paul Thomas Anderson said something to the effect of how like a friend of his or maybe his stepmom, I'm not sure, is Japanese, and that when people talk to her, that it seems like they don't even notice it, but they will just like affect a Japanese dialect, thinking presumably that will make them easier to understand. And there's a lot of stuff like that. You mentioned, Michael, that Alana at her day job is kind of sexually harassed by her boss and stuff like that, where the movie sort of presents those things, and it does so from like a sense of remove and just kind of like a frank depiction of those less savory aspects. I'm curious your take on some of those aspects.
Well, I want to get into all that, but I really quickly just wanted to take a second and shout out this episode's sponsor. Believe it or not, this episode is brought to you by Mountain Dew. Now, there are times when you're looking for something to drink and you know that only one drink will do, and that's Mountain Dew. So the next time you want a truly, truly refreshing break, you deserve more than just to be satisfied. You deserve to be totally blown away, which is what you'll get from Mountain Dew. So if you're thirsty, if you want to pause this, grab a tasty dew, get your energy up, come back. Cool. If not, grab one later. But wanted to at least shout our friends at Mountain Dew out. Back to Licorice Pizza, though. A movie that actually involves PepsiCo owns Mountain Dew. Yeah. So clear tie in there. But no, I think you brought up so many interesting things right there. It's enough to talk about for a whole podcast.
And apologies, I did not know we were going to. I didn't know we were going to segue into an ad read. I wouldn't have brought up all the deep end aspects of the movie right before. Sorry, Mountain Dew.
I know. I love that's what they want. But I mean, one interesting thing you said, which is a larger point about the film, is there has been a lot of discussion around this film about some of the things you mentioned and the ethics and morality, I guess, of those. So I mean, so there's obviously the John Michael Higgins character that. There's been a lot of talk about his affected sort of Japanese dialect. And I will say that was an interesting one because the first time I saw the film, the audience responded to that with like an appropriate kind of horror and like feeling of being uncomfortable, which is react to that. And The second time I saw it, people laughed as if it was like supposed to be funny, which did make me feel a little uncomfortable. There's also discussion of, Alana and Gary's relationship. She's, 25 at a later point in the film. She says she's 29. Gary, who's 15, and their relationship. Spoiler alert, they don't have sex, but, there's clearly some sort of romantic feeling there. And I think this movie is kind of highlighted a lot of discussion about the role of like morality in art. And I think that it leads to sometimes these really bad readings of films where, because a bad thing happens in the movie, the filmmaker could get accused of wanting us to do that. I remember a great tweet from comedian Heather Ann Campbell when Joker came out. She's the best. And, there's a lot of panic when the movie Joker came out. I'm sure many of you remember. And she had a tweet that said something like, my favorite part of the movie is at the very end when he turns to the camera and says, now you go do Joker stuff. And I thought that kind of encapsulated like a really weird tendency people have with films, which is to sometimes, a woman in her 20s has a vaguely romantic relationship with a 15-year-old. So he is saying, young ladies, start grooming your boys, pick them out and groom them. And that's not what's happening in the movie. But, I think that it's been interesting to see that discussion around the film. I think there's, more interesting things to talk about, but definitely brings that to the forefront. And, before we were recording today, we even talked about briefly another new movie, Red Rocket, that also has led to discussions of if when a movie depicts behaviors that are bad, immoral, illegal, should we be uncomfortable about that? Should filmmakers be held accountable for portraying those things?
One of the things that I really loved about the relationship, you said that there are probably more interesting things to talk about, and I'm curious to sort of like flip the conversation a little bit. That there's been, a lot said about the negative aspects of this relationship as depicted. One of the things that I took away from the movie was a lot more positive, at least with regards to how I viewed the two of them, that this was, or as it seemed to me, this was like a young, confused woman who's kind of like maybe trying to make one last grasp at childhood and, sort of the days gone by and trying to take a moment to maybe stop and smell the roses because she realizes that, reality is knocking a little bit and she kind of has to figure out what she wants to do with her life. And that can be very scary and frustrating.
Well, it
may not be.
I was going to say, and I think those are the parallel journeys we have in the film, right? You have Alana's character who's in her 20s and is caught between wanting to hold on to this aspect of like freedom and possibility that you associate with youth. Then you have Gary, who is a teenager, who's out here starting businesses as if he's, some business school grad. Yeah, like a Tenenbaum, of course. So we kind of have these characters almost meeting in the middle. The older person holding on to their youth, the younger one who just wants to be an adult, and I think sees some of that in her. And that space in the middle, a really interesting relationship in the film.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a weird confluence of like what their interests and desires are at this point in their lives, whether it's for him to be taken seriously and to be validated as a person by an older woman, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's necessarily everything that the movie is focused on. And for her to just be able to like not necessarily recede or regress, but to be able to feel like within this like taxonomy of like her, him, all of his little friends and minions that help him with she is an authority figure. Like one of the first times that they spend any amount of time together is that she accompanies him as a chaperone to an industry event in New York City. And it's this weird kind of thing of like, she can sort of blend in to both worlds a little bit, where their relationship dynamic is what it is, but because she is an adult, she is able to give him the sort of like the stamp of approval from the world of adults to be able to open doors for him and stuff like that. It's kind of funny the way that they trade on their the very things that they're trying to sort of like push off to the margins in the pursuit of their own interpersonal relationship.
Yeah, and it's fun that Lana in a few scenes at home with her family, actually played by her actual family, her sisters who make up the band,
Yeah.
Haim or Haim, however one says it, and her parents. And in those scenes, it's very clear, kind of like she literally is in real life. She is the baby of the family, the one who the parents are giving shit to. She has older sisters who seem like they have more going on with their life. So when she's with Gary and his friends, or she refers to them, Gary and his 15-year-old friends, she does get to be like the cool in charge person. She's the one who can drive the car. She's the one who can chaperone.
Who can expertly back up a cube truck down the Hollywood Hills. In the most nerve-wracking scene in all of 2021 cinema. I was sitting on the edge of my seat as she backed that bad boy down the
well,
down
I
the
did
Hollywood
learn
Hills.
this. One of the screenings I went to, Paul Thomas Anderson and Alana Haim came out afterwards and did a Q&A, and it was really great. And something they talked about was the first day of shooting. So the first day that the real life person, so when she had to film scenes backing up a truck while Bradley Cooper leaned over her and sort of like vaguely harassed her and like kissed her while talking to her, and in an incredible scene. But just having this person say like, it was my first day ever acting and Bradley Cooper was leaning on top of me as I drive a car. She also said that they filmed those scenes for a few days, and at the end of it, Bradley Cooper kind of snapped out of it and was like the sweetest guy ever, and was like, I hope you're okay. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. Because I guess when he was playing John Peters, he just went all in for like a 72-hour window. Yeah. As you can tell when you see the movie, he goes all in.
He really goes for it. Yeah.
But yeah, so it was interesting to hear just the experiences of these young actors being in these situations where they've never been in a film before, and now you're opposite Sean Penn and Bradley Cooper in the same movie. But
I had
nope.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just gonna say I had avoided the trailers and any marketing that I could. I always, when I'm really excited about a movie, I want to kind of go in as cold as possible and just let the movie work its magic. And as I was walking into the theater, I saw a big Licorice Pizza standee, and couldn't help but see some of those names on the marquee: Sean Penn, Bradley Cooper. And that was the first time I had noticed or become aware of that in any capacity. And kind of the entire movie, not that I was sitting there waiting for, I'm not like a huge Bradley Cooper fan or whatever, but as the movie goes on and goes on and goes on, I'm sitting there kind of thinking to myself, like, how are they going to fit Bradley Cooper into this thing? Like, when is he going to show up? And then he comes out as John fucking Peters. And I leaned over to my girlfriend at that point. I was like, oh boy, this is going to get really rough. And sure enough, similar to some of the stuff that we were talking about with regards to like depicting more problematic aspects of the era and certain folks within this milieu, like he gives a performance that is like so totally devoid of ego with this. I mean, I can imagine someone such as himself, after kind of ascending out of the sort of frat bro comedy school that he came up in. You know, he's an actor studio trained performer, but for so long he was just that kind of like, he was Wedding Crashers. He was The Hangover. He's that really nasty, bullyish, like just the worst of the worst kind of toxic guy. And to see him go to like Academy Award nominated director and actor, et cetera, and then to still kind of like have both his feet on the ground for a performance like this and be willing to come out, like you said, just come out swinging for the fences and just going for something that's so unsavory and so nasty, is like, it really is one of those performances that does kind of like steal the movie.
Yeah. I mean, the Bradley Cooper's time in the film reminds me of like, you know, you see this in a lot of old cartoons when, you know, a cartoon cat is in a bathtub and someone throws a toaster into the tub and gives it a jolt of electricity. His performance is like the toaster in the tub in that movie. It just is this jolt of manic electricity and like danger. I mean, God, his line read when he says, love Tail so much, it's going to get me killed one day, is just amazing. So yeah, but I think it's a cool move on, again, to heap praise on Paul Thomas Anderson, to have two unknown first-time actors anchoring your film and then having some really big-time, incredible performances from great actors, and you just give them like 5 minutes of screen time, just a little dash of Tom Waits and Sean Penn throughout the film, but really leaning into those young characters and letting them carry the film.
And speaking of those, we've talked a little bit about performances, but Cooper Hoffman, I think Alana Haim has gotten her due, but he's phenomenal in
Incredible.
this movie. I think there was similar to what I was saying before. I didn't know that was Philip Seymour Hoffman's son going into the movie because I hadn't read into it. I didn't want to know who was in the movie, and I don't even know if I had seen his name, maybe in the beginning credits or something like that. But I hadn't put two and two together until there's a moment where he is sitting across the table from Alana, and he's on the phone I think he's trying to wrangle up some pinball machines at that point. And she's kind of giving him grief, and they get into what is like very much coded as a sort of domestic dispute. And he has a few line reads, and he just gives her a look that was so perfectly his dad, like so evocative of his father, that in that moment like all the pins fell into place in my head, and I was like, oh my God, he's got it. Like whatever his old man had, I think Philip Seymour Hoffman, one of the finest screen actors of this or any generation, he's phenomenal. But I'm really excited to see if Cooper Hoffman does some other stuff after this, because he clearly has the knack. He was really,
and there's just a sweetness to his performance as well that makes it makes it believable that this 15-year-old kid could pull off all the shit he pulls off. Worth noting as well that his character is based on a guy, I think his name is Gary Getzman, a Hollywood producer who was a child actor, and many of the pretty crazy things that happened in the film are based on real stories he's told Paul Thomas Anderson over the years. So a lot of that is grounded in history. Like he did start a waterbed company. He was a child actor and all these sorts of things. There's one thing I wanted to bring up to put my philosophy bro hat on for a second, but I think a consistent theme throughout, I think, most of PTA's films, especially since Magnolia, is I do think he's interested in, and I won't even say capitalism, I will say American capitalism. And in different films, he's explored, I think, both capitalism and religion. The peak of this is, of course, There Will Be Blood, where in the character of Daniel Plainview, we just see, like, what does the American capitalist id look like as, like, a person? And
unvarnished.
Yeah, and where does that lead you? And I think in this movie, it's kind of in the background, because it's a beautiful movie, and it's a movie where you smile a lot. And the final scene is beautiful. So many of the musical choices really get you feeling good. But it's ultimately a sad story, because at least in my mind, for both of these characters, we see them running up against the pressures put on them by the capitalist economy and media infrastructure and all this sort of stuff. You have Gary, who, lives with his mom. He's kind of like responsible for their family finances. And it becomes clear at a certain point in the film that he's not on the way up as a child actor. Like, he's peaked. He's probably not going to be booking more stuff. So there's a reason he's trying to start all these businesses and becomes a little hustler, because it's like he sees, how can I have power and importance in America, I need to be making money. I need to be starting businesses. I need to be taking care of my family. You have a similar thing with Alana, where she's working these shitty jobs she doesn't like. She's not happy. In the back half of the movie, we see her try to be the adult she thinks she should be. And in one part, that's her trying to be an actor and existing in that world for a little bit until she gets tossed off of a motorcycle. And in another part of that, she gets involved in politics for a campaign for a local politician played by Benny Safdie. And in both cases, we see how, in trying to live in the adult world, the world of political and entertainment success, it sucks. And in both cases. And she sees that there's a lot of shit going on in those worlds, and that it's not as magical as you would think it is. And in a sense, then I see the relationship between Gary and Alana is almost these last days of two characters kind of like, fighting against the dying of the light, fighting against the encroachment of a world. It's not going to be fun. And we see that, like, the movie's set against the backdrop of the oil shortage that hit America in the early 70s. And, a lot of stuff in, like, because that's the Nixon era, right? Yeah. Right? Or is that? Yeah, okay. And I don't know, I'm curious what you think about that, because I do think that's something for me that's one of the interesting themes throughout his films. And I liked how it wasn't at the forefront. It doesn't hit you over the head with it. But I think you really feel that in the background throughout the movie.
Yeah, there's a moment where it's really beautifully illustrated, just on screen in a single frame, as Gary is sitting out in a waiting room before an audition for, he's a child actor for a child role, and it's him, and he's 15 years old, and it's him and like a bunch of kids probably half his age and easily half his size, as they're all sitting against the wall. It's like he's just a mountain in the middle of this straight flat plain. And then as soon as he gets called in to read, they immediately respond to like, "Oh, you've grown up. Take a look at you." And I think he is, while not discouraged or dismayed by that, he's smart enough to know that like the writing's on the wall a little bit, and he has enough of a nest egg built up from, maybe some projects that he's done and the business that he and his mom run together, that he can still sort of, at this, he's not too old to reinvent himself at 15. Like, he can figure out a way to pivot. And you mentioned sort of Alana's travails through politics and acting in her own right. That those scenes always very much feel like, I don't necessarily want to say like she's playing an adult, but she is kind of playing a role, and she's trying to see how she can like fit within these systems. And I think you mentioned Benny Safdie's character. There's something really beautiful that the film illustrates with him as well, that like tying in this notion of forbidden love between Alana and Gary. Benny Safdie's character, who is running for mayor of LA, it's revealed later on, after he asks Alana out for a couple of drinks, when she finally meets him at the restaurant, he's there with his boyfriend or his partner, and he asks Alana to walk out with his partner so that no one sees the two of them leaving together. And it is this really, it's this a really lovely scene, because that obviously it hurts his partner, and they spend some time sort of unpacking that. But because the movie structure just kind of dips in and out of these other characters' lives, you only get this one snapshot. And it is one of those things that kind of, while the film is playing with the sort of like permissiveness of the culture at the time, there's also an aspect of repression and the anxiety that comes with that. And it's really interesting how the film, with each new vignette, is constantly sort of scrutinizing that dichotomy.
Oh my God, absolutely. And I think, that's a really heartbreaking scene when you see a Safdie character who plays Joel Walks, who's an actual guy. I listened to an interview with him. There was an actual guy who was on city council in LA, ran for mayor, eventually moved to New York. He now runs like the Warhol Foundation and gives grants to up and coming conceptual artist. So that's fun. And eventually was able to come out and live a fun life as an openly gay man. Props to him. But another scene of the film that was really tragic is there is a scene where Alana's character is with Sean Penn's character, who's playing a version of I'm forgetting now, but you'll know.
He's like playing a version of William Holden.
And there's a scene where like he's basically just reading lines from a film. Alana literally says like, "Is this like lines? I don't know what you're talking about.
Is this real?"
And and at one point she says to him, "But I'm sexy, right?" And he's like not even paying attention. And it's so clear that she's just looking for this affirmation and this belonging, while across the table, Gary and his friends, they come in with an assassin's focus to try to give them bad vibes. But it really, I think there's early on in the movie, Alana's character is so intense. Like the first thing she says to like Gary is like, "Ugh, creep." And we see her kind of open up, and you see those cracks emerge throughout the film. And I think like another PTA theme is happening throughout the movie as well, where we see found families. Because it happens over and over again in PTA movies, both for better or worse, where we see people create communities and families often outside of their biological, bad version of that in something like The Master, where that can be used in a manipulative way. I think in this film, we see it happen in a really nice way, where Gary and Alana and Gary's friends create something of a family and find some love and meaning and purpose together in a way that's pretty beautiful.
Yeah, and the film is constantly positioning that through the lens of the era as well. That you brought up that scene where Gary and his boys go into the tail of the cock to try and well, not necessarily intentionally to try and get in her head or whatever, but once they see that she's there, they make a point of, trying to sit near her. And there's this great moment where the restaurant's maitre d' comes up to Gary and he goes, maybe you don't want to eat here tonight. Maybe you want to take your friends to a pizza parlor, blah, blah, blah. It reminded me of the sloppy steaks bit
Yeah.
from I Think You Should Leave.
Oh my God.
Of just like this guy trying to avert a disaster. And you get this sense, like the reason I bring that up in the context of the era is that, like, despite the fact that he is 15 years old, everyone in this movie treats him like he is more of an adult and more of an authority than they really afford Alana's character. Mm-hmm. And so often she is, whether it's, not necessarily with the political stuff, although she's kind of used as a beard in that one scene. But throughout her adventures in filmmaking or her dalliance with movie auditions, she's constantly being infantilized and constantly being objectified, to the point where on the back of Sean Penn's motorcycle, the last thing she asks him is like, do you even remember my real name? Because he keeps calling her Grace in reference to Grace Kelly. And there is a, like, while there is that found family aspect to it, I was weirdly kind of thinking of, I don't know if you've ever read anything about Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn's relationship.
No.
They, of course, did tons of films together. They were a couple up until his death. And they were together for quite some time. And Katharine Hepburn's entire on-screen persona is so fiery. She was kind of like, the one of the early models of, like, the woman in charge, and she's just always there with a joke, and she gives as good as she gets, and she was able to turn the Cary Grants and the Jimmy Stewarts of the world on their head on screen, and that's why people loved her so much. And despite that on-screen persona, when you read about her off-screen relationship with Spencer Tracy, it was like, while they had, to my understanding, by all accounts, a mostly healthy relationship, he was still, like, very domineering and kind of repressive mm-hmm. with how, how they were presented as a couple. And while, to bring it back to Licorice Pizza, while there is a sense of, like, familial bonding in this, and while there is, like, a clear romantic chemistry between the two of them, it's mostly chaste up until, the end of the film when they kiss. And then there's also a scene where she shows him her boobs, if you can imagine such a thing. There is still this notion that because Gary is so type A, that even if they age out of the distasteful aspect of this relationship, if, they're able to maintain this sort of back and forth for the next 10 or 20 years until their relationship is a little bit more acceptable, you do get the notion that, like, oh, he may still be a product of mm-hmm. his era in kind of the worst way. That, like, right now he goes exactly as far as anyone will let a 15-year-old go, but what happens when that same personality is throwing around his weight at 30 mm-hmm. or 40? And it is kind of, I think the movie it benefits from the fact that we never have to see that. We never have to see where this goes. Because in my mind, I think this is, the way that I read the film is that this is maybe one crazy summer. and that, you know, eventually these two are going to part ways. This is just untenable.
Yeah.
But for the moment that we capture them, it's, you know, it's just it's a lovely collection of memories between the two of them.
Yeah.
But I don't
Well,
know. What do
I
you
think
think?
I agree with what you're saying, and I think it's stated well in some dialogue from Gary's character in their first meeting at the Tail of the Cock, um, where he says, "I'm not going to forget you, and you're not going to forget me." And it sounds really intense when he first says it, but I think it gives that read that you just pointed out, that it's one summer of their lives. They're both going to grow in different directions, but they're not going to forget that. And they're not going to forget those experiences. And those are going to be formative to who they are. And I think it reminds you that just because the beautiful summer ends or the interesting relationship ends or the career doesn't mean it wasn't great while it happened. It doesn't mean it can't still be a formative experience. As we kind of wrap up here, I'm curious, um, how do you rate this in the Paul Thomas Anderson oeuvre? Um, and I'm not going to ask you to rank all the movies or anything, but I don't know. In
No, no,
general,
no.
where does this fit for you?
I like it a lot, but I think it's one that, like I said before, I kind of need to see it again.
Hmm.
I mean, for example, I mentioned before my favorite film of his is Phantom Thread, but the first time I saw that movie, I kind of left the theater not really knowing what I had seen. And I think that's a testament to the film itself, that like kind of similar to Licorice Pizza in a way, that while it's positioned as a romance, you don't really understand the shape that the film is taking
Hmm.
until the end of it. Um, so I don't know. I don't think I could place it exactly in my mind. I know it's very difficult for me to imagine anything breaking into like my top three at this point. I like Phantom Thread. I would say after that, There Will Be Blood, and then probably Boogie Nights, and those are just so fucking solid to me. This one I really, really like, but it feels like we were saying before, it feels somewhat inauspicious, and that's not to take anything away from it, but it feels like something that is much more about a
Hmm.
feeling and something that he wanted to express and capture some memories on film. And I think whatever he does next will be all the better for it. That maybe he'll you know, push himself a little bit more, or dream a little bit bigger with regards to you know, the scope of his ambitions. But he's my favorite living filmmaker, and I'm down for whatever he does next. But what about you? Where do you think it
Yeah, I mean, I
ranks?
think it's interesting because I would never say this movie is better than the movies you mentioned. And I think, you know, when we compare it to a movie like There Will Be Blood, which I think we both agree, one of the best movies of the past like 100 years, one of the best movies of American
Love it.
filmmaking, in which one of the best actors in the history of acting puts on a hell of a show while exploring themes that encompass the very question of America and what it means.
Like, what is
Exactly,
America?
right?
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's like I feel like I can't compare the two because Licorice Pizza is such a good hang. It's such a fun movie. It's a movie
Sure.
that I'll probably rewatch a lot. I've seen it twice. I know I'm going to see it a third time soon. I'll probably see it more times than that while it's still in theaters. Whereas There Will Be Blood is a movie that moved me, but I wasn't rushing to get right back into the theater because it leaves you in kind of a heavy spot. Like you walk out of the theater there and you and your buddies kind of like don't say anything for a bit until you're ready. Whereas you walk out of Licorice
It's kind of
Pizza,
a marathon.
yeah,
Yeah.
Licorice Pizza is a movie you can see with friends, walk out of and be like damn, that was fun. Um, Largely too because it has such a great soundtrack. But yeah, I think it's a movie I'm gonna
Phenomenal soundtrack.
watch over and over for years to come. And I think, like you said, it's not going to go down as Paul Thomas Anderson's best, but it'll go down as just a really good movie. So I don't know. I think I can probably speak for both of us in saying that we just recommend you check the movie out if you can. Very much worth a watch.
And I would also recommend, if you're a big P.T. Anderson fan, I just looked it up to make sure that I got the title right. I think the Venn diagram of Wisecrack fans and Paul Thomas Anderson fans, this is perfect for the folks right in the middle. There's a great book called Blossoms and Blood: Postmodern Media Culture and the Films of Paul Thomas Anderson,
Hmm.
that covers. I think it covers everything up to like Inherent Vice.
I will say
Um,
that Wisecrack, and this will probably come out around the same time as this podcast, might have a video coming out on PTA that interacts
Ooh,
with that
beautiful.
book and kind of talks
Oh,
about some of the themes
perfect.
from that. So very, very good, I guess, like brand synergy right now by accident.
Yeah. And obviously, Talking to Tan is not a Wisecrack podcast, but I
No,
think
we've hacked
we
into
do
the
have
feed.
some
Yeah.
we have some crossover audience, certainly.
100%.
But I'm really eager to see that video, man.
Hey, me too. And if you're listening to this, watch it and let us know what you think. But Raymond, thanks for having me on. Talking to Ton is always very fun and very exciting to talk about this movie, this director. I mean, it just, I mean, some of the comments will say, A, where is a discussion of 2021 French film Titan? And B, why did you guys just agree so much? But sorry, we talked about American filmmaker and the movie's good. So yeah, enjoy. Yeah, classic Talking to Ton.
And while we're breaking ranks from our usual discussion, I'm curious if you have any other movies that you saw this year other than Titan, other than Licorice Pizza. Do you want to throw out any recommendations or maybe some of your favorites from the year?
Off the top of my head, and these are some movies that maybe wouldn't normally talk about on Talking to Ton or Show Me the Meaning. One of my favorite movies of the year is Bergman Island. Yeah, Culture Binge, yeah. But there's a movie came out this year called Bergman Island that I loved. I still find myself thinking about it. I would highly recommend checking that out if you can. I loved this movie more than a lot of other people. I think I love The French Dispatch. I understand why some people didn't like that. And then this is a recency bias thing, but also really loved Red Rocket, which I just saw. And I'm still very, very much looking forward to seeing Tragedy of Macbeth, a single Coen brother film.
Likewise.
So, yeah, how about you? What are some films that you saw this year in the podcast before that stood out to you?
Boy, across different podcasts, I've talked about a lot of favorites this year. Obviously, Titan, Green Knight is probably still my favorite of the year.
I finally just saw that. It was so good. Yeah.
Did you just watch it? Yeah. I loved Judas and the Black Messiah, which we talked about over on SNTM. I really, really liked.
What a year!
Yeah. I think that was one that kind of maybe it got bumped into 2021. I'm not sure. Everything was so weird in the early days of the pandemic. Unlike now, where everything is cool and normal. Pig, I'll second The French Dispatch. I thought was very good, and also one that hasn't been getting a lot of love, but I just rewatched it yesterday. Because I'm quite fond of it, and its filmmaker is Seance. It's written and directed by Simon Barrett, who wrote such films as Your Next and The Guest. And Seance is really fun. It's kind of like a slasher / giallo / ghost story, and it's maybe not the most auspicious film on any end of the year lists, but if you have a Shudder subscription, I would definitely recommend checking it out.
Amazing. Well, thanks for those, and I bet we'd like to hear what movies people liked. Well, how could people let us know if there are films they loved, if they want to disagree with us about films we loved, or just wanted to talk about Licorice Pizza or Titan? How could they get in touch with us?
Well, you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd. I'm at Crematoria, and
I'm at Michael O. Burns on Twitter, and then on Letterboxd, I think it's Burns for 2069, but you can maybe just track me down there. And then if they wanted to get in touch with the podcast in general, what would that email address be?
Well, of course, there's talkin.titan@gmail.com. But if you want to contact us at Show Me the Meaning, it's probably on the screen.
I think it's movies@wisecrack.co is where you'd go. Once again, that's movies@wisecrack.co. And if you wanted to call, 213-534-8807. That's 213-534-8807. I would love some people to call and just leave in a quick message, because we can't play it if it's too long. Tell us your top 5 movies of the year and just say them. Just give a quick list, maybe a few sentences overall if you want. I'm just going to ask for that. So call us at 213-534-8807. Let us know your top 5 of the year, or email us at movies@wisecrack.co. Also let us know your top 5. Would love to hear what everyone's been watching and enjoying this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Hit us up with recommendations.
Yeah, well, I guess that's it for this episode of Talking to Ton. Thank you once again for the Show Me the Meaning gang and Wisecrack Incorporated for letting us air this on their prestigious network. Thank you, Raymond, as always, for having me on. And we will be back soon to continue discussing Titan. And I think if I had this correctly, we were going to break down the first party scene with the firemen and talk about the specifics of how French firemen dance to the music of Future Islands and what that says about the decline of culture.
And then in 2022, we're just going to be doing a minute-by-minute analysis where we cover 1 minute of the film per day. So believe me, you think we've said all that could be said about Titan at this point? Absolutely not. No, we haven't even breached the surface.
Okay, well, we will see you soon. Thanks again. And no matter what Raymond tells you, this has been Show Me the Meaning. We'll be bye.